One of my old teachers, Alan Jacobs, wrote a book on the poetry of W.H. Auden, Whiston Auden. A critic had said, had written an article called "What Became of Whiston?" Because Auden moved to America, and the critic was implicitly saying, "Boy, what happened to this guy?" And Jacobs wanted to say, "Well, what did become of Whiston?" And he looked at some of the continuities and discontinuities in the poetry on the assumption that he's still the same person, and he hadn't just fallen off a cliff somewhere and was still writing good poetry. So I want to know what became of Thomas. That is, as we look at Thomas Stearns Eliot, T.S. Eliot's poetry, he goes through a number of phases, maybe most significantly marked by his conversion to Christianity. But I think both of you all want to argue that there's still a deep continuity. He found, let's say, the answer in Jesus, but he still was asking the same question, a question that constellated around the real threat of profound meaninglessness in modernity. Joe, will you talk us through Eliot's diagnosis of the sort of fundamental question of meaninglessness in modernity?
Sure. You know, one thing that often comes up when teaching is how much is Eliot a war poet, and that is, you know, how much was he influenced or, you know, part of the atmosphere that came after World War I and just the devastation that wrought on European and to some extent American culture. And the more that I look into the poems myself, and the students are very interested in that, and they're just, is that yellow fog, does that refer to poison gas, you know, the yellow fog in Proof Rock, and trying to find any kind of war angle. The more that I look at it, it seems like, though that might be in the background, that the questions that he's interested in, or the problems that he sees, are much more internal problems of people not able to find a reason for living, find a meaning in their lives. The Proof Rock is my kind of the starting point for me, and when he's talking about just he doesn't have the strength to ask the overwhelming question, to push the moment to the crisis, and so his own inability to act, to speak, to make meaning of his life seem to be the kind of diagnosis that Eliot keeps returning to.
This worry that we are the stuffed men, we are the hollow men, with our heads full of hay, and we lean together and consult with one another. That image or other forms of it recur and recur. Language might be insufficient. We might have passed through all of this time, which supposedly would make us better at the human project, but in fact, time and history have not borne out their great reward of progress. But I agree that some of his most piercing images are sort of the individual in the world. In The Wasteland, I think there's a woman who has her guest come over and leave, and Tiresias watches her, and her automatic hand glosses over her hair while she turns on the phonograph. And she is miserable, but not attuned to it.
But apparently, Eliot was also Auden's literary editor. And apparently Auden showed up at Eliot's office one day, and he's playing Patience, solitaire. And Auden says, "You're always playing Patience. What is it about this game?" And Eliot just stone-faced says, "It's the closest thing to being dead." And I mean, you know, just like, wow, here's a man whose poetry is a profound meditation and reflection on very personal even experience of this nearly nihilistic way of being. But he does become a Christian. But I think Melissa, and maybe both of you, your sense is that he doesn't, that question doesn't disappear for him and maybe continues to haunt him. Can you talk about that? Like when we get to the four quartets, is that question still just as much up and running? Does he live under that threat in the same way?
So I would say not in the same way, if I'm following your question. I think Eliot insists that the problems that he has become attuned to, the threat of meaningless human existence, it lingers, but the hope that God made man, that the incarnation has in fact transformed this cosmos, he presses into it, and I think finds in that a resonant hope. And so I would want to say there's resolution in the four quartets to a number of problematics that are set out before, but they're not abandonments, and they're not resolutions that say this is no problem. They're resolutions that affirm, here are deep problems.
This is a soluble problem, though, ultimately, maybe, even if only eschatological.
And yet maybe soluble goes the wrong direction in that, like, oh, we can figure this out, whereas rather it seems to be that he, with Christianity, begins to look outside himself and outside the modern experience for something that could come and bring salvation or grace or some kind of sense of meaning. One of the things that you were talking about earlier, Melissa, has to do with time and just whether time could save us, and that we have not found a solution in history, and yet God has entered history, and God enters our personal histories in certain significant moments of time that rise up kind of like a wave and take us with them. So that the early idea of like a life that's measured out in coffee spoons, or one even in the four quartets he talks about life that's measured by the chronometer and the machine, as opposed to this other vision of time where there's the bell on a buoy out at sea that rises and rings as the swells of the waves come under it. And so there's these natural movements of grace that we could become attuned to within that he looks to with hope.
Let me ask you, actually, let me just interrupt and ask you all to think very practically like teachers as we close here. I'm someone who's listening to this. I've never read Eliot, or I read a tiny bit of Eliot, and he was incredibly hard. Can you give me one hook that can get me back into Eliot? Either one poem, or one way to read him, or one small thing I can do that might give me just enough of a handhold that I can start climbing this great mountain.
Yeah, and mine relates to sort of what we were talking about. I think if you can read the four quartets with an eye for Adam and Eve is actually, I think, a way in, so that the first movement of the first quartet has this strange image where you go to this garden and there are children in it, but you're not really getting to see this garden in the past. And if you start to ask questions with Eliot about what is this history that became a mirage for us, this history where Adam and Eve could have stood in paradise, read with that in mind, how does a human person this side of Eden start to make sense of the unfolding history of the world, and then to the final stanza where we say at the end of our exploring, we will arrive at the place where we started and know it for the first time, so that finally the fire, the purgatorial fire of the human experience, and the rose, the celestial gathering of all of the saints, where they will be one thing in the good economy of God.
That's great. Joe, you got a hook for us?
Well, earlier we were talking about Eliot as a kind of doctor who's diagnosing a problem, and so often you'll read a page of Eliot and you think, I'm not sure what this is talking about, but these two lines, they really speak to my experience and the emptiness that I sometimes experience. Or this line over here really sounds like it could offer a solution, a solution that comes from outside of us, from the grace of God.
The Torrey Honors Institute at Biola University. Biblically centered, great books, liberal education. More at biola.edu/Torrey.